Clara had been dreaming of this day for what felt like an eternity, the kind of dream where she could feel the anticipation crawling under her skin, and the weight of every sacrifice she'd made finally about to pay off for the first time in months. She was about to board a flight to see her grandmother, who had raised her with love and care. But now her grandmother was sick, really sick, and Clara knew she needed to be there. But she hadn't expected the strange twist of fate that was about to unfold. The morning had started like any other, with the sharp scent of coffee in the air and the hum of the busy airport around her. She joined the line at the check-in counter. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held her ticket, clutched tightly in her palm. She had saved every penny for this trip, working long hours at a job that barely paid the bills. She was proud of how far she'd come, even if others couldn't see it. As she stepped forward to hand the attendant her ticket, the woman behind the counter gave Clara a quick glance, then paused, her eyes narrowing just for a moment. Then she flicked her gaze back to the computer screen without a word, as if Clara hadn't existed. For a split second, Clara felt it like a punch to the gut, that brief moment of dismissal and judgment. She didn't know if it was the way she looked, or the fact that she was wearing an old jacket that had seen better days, but something in the air told her this wasn't going to be a pleasant experience. The attendant finally took the ticket and scanned it with robotic indifference, and as the beep echoed through the terminal, the words that followed made Clara's heart skip. "Are you sure you can afford this flight?" The attendant's tone was casual, but it cut deep. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. As she fought to keep her composure, she didn't know how to respond. She'd been preparing for this moment for so long, but the judgment had caught her off guard. She wanted to say something sharp to defend herself, but instead she smiled awkwardly and nodded, trying to force the words out of her mouth. But they wouldn't come out. The attendant's gaze lingered on her for a second longer, and then she waved her through without another word. Clara walked away feeling small, her confidence shattered and replaced with the cold weight of humiliation. As she headed toward the boarding gate, Clara found herself wishing she could just disappear into the crowd. But it wasn't over yet. As she waited in line, she could hear the same attendant talking to her colleague from across the room. The conversation wasn't meant for her ears, but it was loud enough to be heard clearly. "I don't know how some people think they can travel when they can barely afford to keep a roof over their heads." The words hit her like a slap. Clara's face flushed with heat. She wanted to turn around and confront them, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the fear of making a scene. Maybe it was the nagging voice in her head telling her to just get on the plane and forget about it. But the sting of those words followed her as she made her way to her seat. The flight was about to begin, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this journey wasn't just about seeing her grandmother. It was about something deeper, something that she couldn't yet understand, but she knew she would have to face it soon. As the minutes dragged on, Clara sat in her seat, feeling the weight of those cruel words press against her chest. The cabin around her felt louder now, not with noise, but with an oppressive silence. It was as if everyone was watching her, waiting for her to somehow prove she belonged here or didn't. But she wasn't sure she could do that anymore. Maybe she wasn't enough. Maybe she wasn't meant to be here. And just as those dark thoughts began to creep in, a voice rang through the speakers, breaking her thoughts. "We'll be boarding shortly. Please remain seated until further instructions." The words were standard, the kind everyone hears, but to Clara they felt like a reminder of how little control she had over the situation. Then it happened again. The flight attendant appeared in the aisle this time. Her gaze lingered on Clara, as if searching for something. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was judgment, but Clara couldn't read her face. The woman stopped by her seat, and without a word adjusted the overhead compartment above Clara's head. But then she spoke loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "You sure you'll be able to reach up there? Or is this too much for someone like you?" The words sliced through the air, more cutting than the first time, but Clara wasn't sure if she should be angry or if she should simply keep her head down. She could feel the heat rising to her cheeks. But she held her ground, hoping no one else was listening. But it wasn't enough to escape the snickers from the people sitting nearby. They were quiet at first, but Clara could hear them clearly now, and it felt like the whole world had decided to focus on her just one more time. Clara had been preparing for this trip for months, and yet here she was reduced to a target for ridicule. She wanted to scream to tell them how hard she worked, how much she'd sacrificed. But the words wouldn't come. She sat frozen, trying to find a way out of this moment. Without drawing more attention to herself, she glanced out of the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway, and the reality of her situation hit her harder than ever. Before, she was stuck in this seat, trapped by the judgment of others, trapped by her own fear. The flight attendant walked away, but the whispers didn't stop. Clara could feel the eyes of the people around her boring into her skin. They were watching her every move, and she hated it. But what could she do? What could she say? She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. But then she felt a tug deep inside her gut, a pull that seemed to whisper to her to hold on just a little longer, to push through this moment and let it pass. Maybe this was just another obstacle, one that she had to face before she could truly move forward. It felt absurd, even as she thought it, but there was something in her gut that told her this wasn't the end of her journey, not yet. Just as she was about to close her eyes and drown out the sounds around her, the intercom buzzed again. But this time the message was different. "We are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated until we receive further instructions." It wasn't anything unusual, but Clara's heart skipped a beat. Something about the way the words were delivered made her uneasy. The passengers around her were starting to stir. They whispered among themselves about the delay, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. The sudden change in the atmosphere unsettled her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. And then, without warning, the lights flickered, and the plane jolted in the air. The sudden movement caused Clara's stomach to flip and her breath to catch in her throat. She grabbed the armrest, her knuckles turning white. Was this the beginning of something much worse? Clara's heart raced as the plane gave another sudden jolt. The lights flickered again, and she felt a cold wave of fear sweep over her. Was it turbulence or something worse? Her mind raced back to the flight attendants who had been rushing up and down the aisle earlier. Their movements were frantic now. The calm professionalism that Clara had initially noticed seemed to be slipping away, replaced by urgency and hushed voices that couldn't quite be hidden. No one knew what was happening, or at least they weren't saying anything aloud, but Clara could feel the unease settle like a heavy weight over everyone. She gripped the armrest tighter, her palms sweating. And as she looked around the cabin, the passengers were starting to whisper too, their faces pale with concern, their eyes darting nervously toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were gathering in small huddles, exchanging rapid whispers. Clara's mind began to spiral. Was this? It was the plane going down. She thought of her grandmother lying sick in bed miles away, and how she might never make it in time. She felt the tears sting behind her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to let fear take control of her. Not now, not when she needed to be strong for herself and for those around her. The flight attendants finally made their way down the aisle again, but this time their faces were different, more strained, their movements quicker and less measured. The tension was palpable. Clara could hear their muffled conversations as they passed by her, but she couldn't make out the words. Not that she wanted to know, not really. They were only going to add to the fear that was creeping in. She watched as one of the attendants stopped abruptly in front of a man seated near the front of the plane who had been clutching his chest, his face pale, as if he was in pain. The attendant bent down into him, whispering something Clara couldn't hear, but the man nodded weakly. And then the flight attendant stood up and turned toward the cabin crew in the front of the plane, giving them a signal that made the other attendants freeze in place. Suddenly the captain's voice broke through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently experiencing a minor issue with the plane. Please remain calm." and stay in your seats. We will have the situation under control shortly." But Clara wasn't sure if she felt reassured by those words, or more frightened. The calm tone in the captain's voice didn't match the chaos unfolding before her. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. And then it happened. The intercom crackled again, this time with a more urgent tone. "Is there a medical professional on board? We need immediate assistance." The words echoed throughout the cabin. Clara's stomach twisted, and her breath caught in her throat. The request wasn't just for a nurse or a doctor, it was for someone with emergency experience, and Clara knew she had exactly what they needed. She wasn't just a traveller, she was a nurse trained in emergency care, and though she had been trying to bury it in the back of her mind, the knowledge was now rising to the surface like a tidal wave of responsibility. Clara's eyes darted around the cabin. The air felt thick with tension. Every second felt like an eternity. But there was no time to hesitate. She stood up. The whispers around her grew louder. But Clara didn't care now. Her heart pounded in her chest. But there was only one thing she could do. She needed to help. As she made her way to the front of the plane, she saw the flight attendants looking toward her. They didn't ask her name or qualifications. But there was a silent recognition in their eyes. Clara could see the fear in their faces, the realization that they needed someone who could take control, and she was the one who had to do it. She reached the front where the elderly man was struggling to breathe. His face was twisted in pain, and his eyes were wide with fear. The flight attendants stepped back instinctively as Clara knelt down next to the man. She didn't have time to think about anything else. Her hands moved quickly, and with confidence she began to assess the situation. But as she worked, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her presence here was more than just a coincidence. Maybe this moment was why she had been pushed to take this flight, why she had been subjected to all the judgment she had endured. Maybe it was all leading to this one act of redemption. The flight attendants and passengers watching her were stunned by her calm. In the midst of the chaos, they didn't know who she was or why she was here, but they would soon find out. Clara could feel the heat rising in her chest. As her hands worked swiftly, she didn't think about anything else, only the man in front of her. His breathing was shallow and weak, but she had done this before. The calmness she had fought so hard to hold on to was beginning to take over her. Once shaky hands were steady now. She moved with practiced precision, checking his pulse, adjusting his oxygen mask, and whispering soft reassurances as she worked. But even though she was focused on the man's condition, her mind couldn't stop racing. Why had she been put in this position? Why had she been made to endure the humiliations from the flight attendants, the cruel words, the dismissive glances? Was this her test? Had she somehow been guided here for this exact moment? The flight attendants watched in stunned silence as Clara continued her work, their eyes wide in disbelief. They hadn't known what she was capable of, but now they were seeing it firsthand. They had underestimated her, thought she was just another passenger, someone too poor to belong. But now she was the one saving the life of a stranger, and the entire cabin was watching her. A hush fell over the plane as the passengers realized what was happening. The man's labored breaths began to even out under Clara's care. But she wasn't finished, yet she needed to stabilize him. And that would take time. She didn't know if they had, but she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. As she worked, the tension in the cabin remained thick, almost suffocating. No one spoke a word, but Clara could feel their eyes on her. She could hear their shallow breaths mingling with her own. They were waiting. They were scared. And in that silence, she found herself questioning everything she had ever believed in. Was this the moment where she finally proved herself worthy to be here? Was this the turning point in her life? Or was it just a fluke, a random twist of fate that put her on this flight at this exact time? The captain's voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently flying at a higher altitude, and the turbulence has passed. Thank you for your patience." But the announcement felt distant, almost insignificant. In the midst of the chaos, Clara didn't care about the altitude or the turbulence. All she cared about was the man in front of her, who was now breathing steadily with the help of the oxygen mask, and her careful hands, she looked up at the flight attendants, who were still standing by, their faces now a mix of admiration and shock. They had never seen her as anything more than a regular passenger, but now they were seeing her in a new light. One of the flight attendants stepped forward slowly. It was the same one who had made those cutting remarks earlier. Her voice was soft when she spoke, "Thank you." Clara didn't respond at first. She just nodded as she continued to check the man's vitals. But the attendant repeated herself, her voice trembling slightly. "No, really, thank you. You saved his life." Those words hit Clara like a freight train. She hadn't expected this kind of gratitude, not after everything she had endured just to get on this flight. But as she met the flight attendant's eyes for the first time, she saw something different there. It wasn't judgment anymore, it was respect. The man's condition had stabilized enough for Clara to feel confident that he would be okay. She gave one last look at his vitals, and then stood up slowly, her knees aching from the position she had been kneeling in, but the adrenaline still coursed through her veins. She turned to the flight attendants, who were now looking at her as if they saw her for the first time, and with a deep breath she smiled softly. The flight was far from over, but Clara had already won something more important than any destination. She had been judged for who she was, but she had just proven who she truly was, not by the clothes she wore or the words she spoke, but by the strength and skill that had always been inside her, and now the world was starting to see it. But just as Clara began to make her way back to her seat, the plane gave another jolt. This time it wasn't as violent, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She looked toward the front of the cabin, where the flight attendants were exchanging worried glances. The tension had returned, and Clara's instincts flared again. Something wasn't right, something was off. Clara returned to her seat, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline, but her body was starting to feel the weight of what she had just done. The plane had calmed for a moment, but the unease in the air was palpable. It wasn't just the turbulence or the medical emergency. There was something else, something that Clara couldn't put her finger on. She glanced around the cabin. Every face was etched with worry. Even the flight attendants were still hovering near the front, looking back at the passengers every now, and then their eyes were wide with apprehension. Clara tried to settle into her seat, but the feeling of dread refused to leave. It gnawed at the pit of her stomach like an itch she couldn't scratch. Something was wrong, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had been so focused on the man in need of help that she hadn't noticed how still everything had become. The hushed voices, the silent glances exchanged between the crew and the passengers. Something was building in the air, and Clara could sense it with every passing second. Then came the announcement again. This time it wasn't the calm voice of the captain, but the frantic crackling of the intercom. "Attention passengers, please remain in your seats. We are encountering some issues with the flight crew and need your cooperation. Please stay calm and do not leave your seats." The words sent a chill down Clara's spine. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Issues with the flight crew. How could that be? What did it mean? The entire cabin fell into an eerie silence. Passengers looked at each other with wide eyes, trying to make sense of the words that had just been spoken. Some murmured nervously, others looked toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants were now huddled in a group, their faces tight with concern. Clara's mind raced. Was there a problem with the plane? Was there something wrong with the crew? Were they in danger? What did the captain mean by issues with the flight crew? And why was it all so vague? She glanced out of the window, trying to focus on anything other than the rising panic inside her. She saw nothing but clouds beneath her and sky above her. It was supposed to be peaceful up here in the air, but all she could feel now was a sense of foreboding. The world beyond the plane felt distant and unreachable. And for the first time since the flight had begun, Clara felt truly alone. She gripped the armrest again, and her gaze shifted to the flight attendants, who were still gathered near the front. They were whispering now, too, their words too soft for Clara to hear, but she could tell they were anxious. There was no denying it anymore. Something was wrong. And then the plane jolted again, not as violently as before, but enough to make Clara's stomach twist. In fear, the passengers around her gasped, and a few muttered prayers. But this time there was no announcement from the captain. The crew remained silent, and Clara could see the unease growing among them. They had stopped pretending everything was fine. At that moment, the flight attendants began moving toward the rear of the cabin. They were moving quickly, but deliberately, and Clara noticed one of them glancing toward her. As they passed, it wasn't the same dismissive glance she had received earlier. It was different this time. It was almost like a look of warning. Something unspoken passed between them, but Clara couldn't figure out what it meant. She watched them disappear into the back of the plane, and then the tension in the cabin grew even heavier. The air felt thick with fear. No one knew what was going on, but they all knew that something wasn't right. Clara's mind raced again, trying to process everything. Was there a threat on board? Was there something happening behind the scenes that no one was saying? But before she could process any further, the lights flickered again. But this time it wasn't just a simple flicker. It was more intense, almost like a warning, like the lights themselves were trying to communicate a sense of danger. And Clara's heart skipped a beat as she looked around the cabin. Once more, every passenger seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, without warning, the plane began to descend rapidly. The rapid descent jolted Clara back to reality. Her stomach lurched as the plane began to drop faster than it should have. The screams of panic echoed through the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests, eyes wide with terror. Clara's heart raced as she looked around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The overhead bins rattled, as if ready to explode. The sound of the engines struggling to keep up with the sudden drop filled the air, a high-pitched whine that made the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand up. She could see the flight attendants rushing toward the front of the cabin, their faces pale with fear. But they didn't stop to reassure anyone. There was no time for comfort, no time for answers. The captain's voice finally came through the intercom again, but it was strained, his words clipped as if he was fighting to keep calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a critical issue. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for emergency procedures." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Critical issue. What did that mean? Was the plane really going down? Her mind flashed to her grandmother and the tears that were now threatening to fall. She had worked so hard to get here, just to see her, just to make sure she wasn't alone in her final days. And now all of that seemed to be slipping away. The panic that had been building in her chest was no longer just an uncomfortable feeling. It was a living thing, a heavy force that took over her entire body. She looked around at the other passengers. Some were crying, others were praying, all of them were clutching their seatbelts, as if that alone could save them. Clara's hands were trembling as she fumbled with her own belt. She felt a strange sense of guilt, a feeling that she hadn't done enough, that somehow she hadn't been meant to make it this far. But even as the fear gripped her, she couldn't let go of the thought that there had to be a way out. The plane lurched again, and the lights flickered once more, this time longer than before. The entire cabin was plunged into darkness for a split second before the emergency lights blinked on, casting an eerie red glow over everything. The air felt thick with anticipation and dread as the plane continued to fall. The flight attendants had disappeared into the cockpit, and there was no one left to guide the passengers. Clara's mind raced, trying to calculate what was happening, but there were no answers, no explanation. All she had was the terrifying drop and the helplessness that spread through her like wildfire. She looked out of the window again, but all she could see was the dark sky and the endless stretch of clouds, nothing to give her hope, nothing to show her where they were heading. And then she felt it, something under her seat, something small but heavy. She reached down instinctively, her fingers brushing over something cold and metallic. She pulled it out and realized it was an oxygen mask. It was dangling from a small compartment under the seat. A moment of confusion flashed over her before she realized what it was, for the others hadn't noticed yet. They were too consumed by their fear. But Clara knew she had to act fast. She ripped the mask free, and with shaking hands she reached for the face of the woman sitting next to her, who was trembling with terror. Clara quickly helped her secure the mask over her face before moving on to the next passenger. And then the next her instincts took over. Even though the fear was rising with every passing second, she couldn't let herself freeze. She had to do something. But as she continued to help the others, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening behind the scenes. The flight attendants weren't just struggling to keep control of the situation, they were hiding something from the passengers. There was a secret, a hidden fear in their eyes that Clara couldn't ignore. Something wasn't right. It wasn't just the plane that was in danger, there was something deeper at play. And whatever it was, Clara knew she was about to find out. Clara's hands were shaking as she moved from passenger to passenger, making sure each one had an oxygen mask, securing them as quickly as she could, but her mind was spinning. What was happening? Why was the plane descending so rapidly? The captain's voice crackled again through the intercom, but this time it was softer, more strained, his words filled with urgency. Attention, all passengers, remain calm. We are attempting an emergency landing. Please brace for impact. The words were clear, but the panic in the cabin was undeniable. The screams of fear grew louder. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Clara could feel it pressing against her chest as she worked to help the others. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow over everything. The faces of the passengers twisted in terror. Some clutched their loved ones, others were frozen in place, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait and pray. Clara's pulse raced as she moved to the back of the plane, but when she turned to glance toward the cockpit, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The flight attendants were standing by the cockpit door, whispering to each other, their faces pale, and their movements agitated. They looked over their shoulders, as if they were trying to keep something hidden from the passengers, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. What were they hiding? She didn't have time to think about it for long. There was no time for questions, no time for anything but survival. The plane jolted again, this time violently. The force of it threw Clara into the side of the aisle, and for a moment everything seemed to spin. The sound of the plane groaning under the strain echoed through the cabin, and Clara could feel the terror rising in her throat. As she struggled to steady herself, her heart slammed against her ribcage. She pushed herself up and grabbed the nearest seat back, steadying herself. As the plane seemed to plummet even faster, the whine of the engines grew louder and louder, almost deafening, and she could feel the fear creeping back into her chest, tightening with every second. There was no time left to help anyone else. Clara thought of her grandmother again, and the pain in her chest grew stronger. Was this, the end of her journey? Would she never get the chance to say goodbye? She clenched her teeth and took a deep breath. She wouldn't let this be the end, not now, not after everything she had been through, after everything she had fought, for she wasn't going to let fear control her. The captain's voice came again, barely audible over the chaos. Prepare for impact. Clara's heart stopped for a moment, but she quickly snapped out of it. There was no room for panic now, only action. She scanned the cabin again, her eyes locking on the flight attendants, who were still standing by the cockpit door. But now they were more frantic. One of them looked over at Clara, his eyes wide with fear and desperation. He quickly turned away, but not before Clara saw the look in his eyes. It was a look of someone who knew something was very wrong, someone who had seen something they weren't supposed to see. Clara didn't know what to do with that information, but she knew one thing for sure: something wasn't right. And it wasn't just the plane, something was going on that no one was saying, something that could change everything. As the plane continued to drop, Clara gripped her seat tighter, her body tense with anticipation. She could feel the earth getting closer with every second. But she wouldn't give in to the fear. She wouldn't let it take over. She had come this far, and she would see it through no matter what. And then it happened. The deafening sound of the engines stopping sent a shockwave through the cabin. The plane went silent for a moment, and Clara's heart pounded louder than ever. It was as if time itself had frozen her pulse thundering in her ears, and then the world seemed to tilt, and the plane slammed into something hard. Clara was thrown forward into the seat in front of her, her face smashing into the fabric, as the entire cabin erupted into chaos. The world exploded in a deafening crash, and Clara felt her body slam into the seat in front of her. Her breath was knocked out of her, and for a moment she couldn't move. Everything around her was chaos. The plane was tilted at an angle, and the emergency lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows over the wreckage. Clara gasped for air, her chest burning, as she struggled to take in enough to stay conscious. The entire cabin was in disarray. The seats had been torn loose, and some passengers were thrown forward, screaming in panic. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Clara blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the acrid smell of fire and fuel filled her nose. She felt a sharp pain in her arm, but she ignored it. She needed to stay alert. She had to get up. She had to help. But her limbs felt like lead, and every breath was a struggle. The plane had stopped moving, but the chaos was far from over. She forced herself to sit up, her head spinning. As she tried to orient herself, everything seemed wrong, and the noise was unbearable. The distant sound of emergency alarms, blaring the cries of the injured, the frantic shuffling of passengers trying to escape. Clara pushed through the pain and tried to focus. Her mind flashed back to the flight attendants, their strange behavior before the crash. What was going on? They had known something they hadn't told the passengers. Had they been involved in this? Somehow Clara's heart raced as she struggled to make sense of everything, the fear, the panic, the confusion. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps running through the aisle. She turned quickly and saw a flight attendant coming toward her, his face pale and his uniform singed from the crash. He didn't say a word at first, just reached out to her to help her stand. Clara was hesitant, but she could see the panic in his eyes. He was just as frightened as everyone else. He helped her to her feet as best as he could, his hands trembling. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, his voice barely audible over the noise of the wreckage. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing with questions. But there was no time for answers. She had to move now. The plane had crashed, but they were still in danger. She could hear the faint sound of sirens outside and knew that rescue crews were on their way. But who knew how long it would take, how long they would have to wait? They moved toward the emergency exits with what little strength Clara had left, but when they reached the door, the flight attendant hesitated, his hand on the handle, his face grim. "We can't open this one," he muttered. "There's debris blocking it." Clara's stomach dropped as the weight of their situation hit her. They were trapped inside a broken plane, surrounded by wreckage, and no way to get out. The flight attendant looked at her, his eyes full of guilt and fear. "There's another exit in the back. We'll have to move fast." Clara didn't waste any more time. She grabbed his arm and pulled him with her as they stumbled toward the rear of the plane. The aisles were cluttered with broken seats and debris, and the smoke was getting thicker. They passed the other passengers who were dazed and confused, some too injured to move, others still in shock. It felt like a nightmare, something she couldn't wake up from. But she pushed forward, refusing to stop. When they finally reached the back door, the flight attendant managed to force it open, and the cold rush of air from the outside hit them like a wave. Clara's legs almost gave out, but she didn't care. She needed to get out. She needed to breathe. They stepped into the safety of the outside world, but the moment they were out in the open, Clara stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. What she saw before her was nothing like what she had expected. The crash site was eerily quiet, no sign of the rescue crews. The only sounds were the crackling of flames from the wreckage and the soft groans of the plane's damaged fuselage. The ground beneath them was dark and empty, stretching far into the distance. And then she saw it in the distance, a shadow moving toward them slowly at first, but then growing closer. It was a figure, a person standing alone amidst the wreckage. But who were they, and what did they want? Clara's instincts screamed at her to run, but she was frozen. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure that was now getting closer and closer, until finally it was close enough for her to see clearly, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It was one of the flight attendants, the same one who had been so frantic earlier, but now his face was different. It was cold and empty, and in his hand was a strange metallic object.